You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Chuck Hoskinson, who's with the Washington Examiner. And first of all, Chuck, it's great to have you, and Happy New Year. I know it's the first time you're on this year, so welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Happy New Year to both of you.
I hope you got some sleep. It was an exciting and just dramatic, and just unusual Super Bowl.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't the NFL's finest hour, I'll say that.
No, it wasn't. You know, John and I were joking before. We were just talking briefly, and it's funny because I made the play at the end of the game where almost anyone else in the world would have just given it to the running back who could just bowl into the end zone and you win the game. It's kind of like if we had a whole mess of M1 Abrams tanks in the Middle East facing off against ISIS or ISIL or whatever we're calling it, IS, and decided to send some press corps in the Jeep instead.
Yeah, that game was like the Iran-Iraq war for me. I was hoping that both sides could lose.
Yeah, we're with you. I mean, John and I are Giants fans, and I found no great reason to root for either of the teams, but just really rooting for a good game that came down to the last play. I just didn't think it would be that way.
No, it's and I wonder if anybody checked the inflation on that ball in the fourth quarter. So
that's a good point. I seriously doubt
because the Patriots got a lot better all of a sudden, you know.
Yeah, it was an interesting game. Actually, you know, the shame of it is at the beginning of the game when that safety had the interception of Tom Brady and then hurt his arm, if he just went down with the ball and gave the ball to the offense, you know, it could have been a completely different game right there.
Yeah, there's a lot of ifs.
Yes, that's right.
It's interesting how few of my friends, most people I know were basically saying, you know, I hope both teams lose because I hate them both. But it's interesting to see if it was the most watched Super Bowl ever. But all I hear from a lot of folks is like, ew. They weren't terribly happy with the game at the end.
Yeah, but it wasn't a bad game. Anyway, so enough with the football. I'm very interested. There's a few things that we're going to discuss today, but you have your latest piece here, and Rep. Martha McSally, we've got a more dangerous world than I've seen in my whole entire life. The second I saw that come out this morning, and I was reading through it right away, it reminded me of on C-SPAN yesterday, I was watching the hearing in the Senate. John McCain's Armed Service Committee had Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Madeleine Albright there, and not for questioning, but really for more of a discussion on national security and threat topics. So it ties right into what you're writing here. And I was very interested to hear what they had to say. But again, it's amazing to me because somewhere towards the end of that hearing, out of all their mouths came the serious threat of climate change. And I'm like, man, maybe I'm not drinking enough. I don't know. But seriously, Chuck, I mean, how do these people go there with all the things that you cover every single day, with everything that we read of yours? Everything is much more serious than climate change.
Well, you have to ask, I mean, where their priorities are. I mean, why is this a priority when, I mean, you listen to the former secretaries of state, and there was another hearing a couple of days previously with retired generals like James Mattis, the former Central Command commander. I mean, basically, the message I'm hearing from a lot of wise people on foreign policy is that the post-World War II order is starting to break down. The post-Cold War order is starting to break down. I mean, the Russians are pretty much taking bites out of Ukraine, one piece at a time, and this is causing a lot of chaos, especially when you figure that the United States, being the sole remaining superpower to come out of the Cold War, has kind of taken its finger off its finger off the button, so to speak, the control button. So, I mean, the message that is coming from foreign policy experts on both sides of the aisle is that chaos is increasing, and that's going to need to be addressed. They may disagree on how to address it, but they don't disagree on the fact that it needs to be addressed.
Well, first off, Charles, listen, we know that chaos is actually part of the Saul Alinsky design plan that both Hillary Clinton and our current POTUS both have as a core part of their upbringing, if you will. I mean, their political nurturing was all based on this. So that makes me very nervous. But I would widen this aperture a little bit and say one need only to just go to Google, pull up the world map, and start looking at the places that are gaining in power and start looking at the places where instability are occurring. And you start realizing how Iran is surrounding basically Israel, but they have a surround and drown attack basically going on in Saudi Arabia, and it's working. You look at the risk and the choke points of taking over North Africa and going north, on and on. But you also could go all the way to our own border. You don't even have to bring up what's going on in Argentina and Venezuela, but look no further than Cuba, right off the coast of Florida. And, one of the first things that I said when the president opened Cuba is watch how long it takes before we see a Russian/Iranian naval base in a place we used to call Guantanamo Bay. Guess what? The Russians were just now putting out in their own in their own newspapers that the best way to respond to U.S. hawks would be with a Russian naval base in Cuba. It is quite scary.
It is, and one of the you mentioned Iran. It's interesting to see that one of the elements of this breakdown of the international order is that smaller powers like Iran see openings to move to expand their own influence and build their power in ways that they couldn't have done so during the Cold War because they were pretty much squeezed between the two sides. And even after the Cold War, the overriding element of U.S. power kind of boxed them in. Now, that's not happening anymore.
That's absolutely correct. Chuck, going back to your most recent article here, the questioning of McSally, and this is very important, about some of the specific issues, and the first one broached was the sequestration and, of course, military readiness. Now, I'd like to address sequestration first because the president released his 7% increase, $4 trillion budget of more taxes, more spending, and more out-of-control madness. But are we spending the correct amount? Is some of the I know you haven't had a chance to review the whole budget, but are some of the things that members of Congress and maybe the White House now are saying that we do need to spend more money on the military, or is the president saying we need to spend more money on other types of security but not the military? And looking from the military perspective, do they recognize that there's a need to increase the spending, at least in that arena where we need to revisit and change the sequestration?
Well, I think the sequestration debate in Washington, I think it would be fair to describe it as a fantasy debate. It's not based on reality. What happened was the defense budget got taken hostage in the dispute between the president and Republicans in Congress over how to reduce the federal budget deficit, how to reduce the federal debt after the Tea Party came on the scene. Well, they shot the hostage, and now they're all standing around going, "It's not my fault, you fix it." There's no, you ask just about anyone in Washington and they'll tell you, "I want to get rid of sequestration." Then you ask them how, and they're going to give you some answer that either draws a red line that makes it impossible to get done, or they provide some proposal that the other side would never accept, so therefore it would never be enacted into law. because everyone has their red lines. Even the Tea Party has their red lines. I mean, if you look at what's the one thing that the Tea Party has done, the people that have been elected to Congress since 2010, what's the one thing they've done to reduce the federal budget deficit? The only tangible success they've ever had in reducing federal spending was sequestration. So there's a lot of folks, a lot of libertarian-leaning Tea Party folks who want to keep it. They want to keep it because it's the only victory they've ever achieved. So even in that sense, you've got a lot of interests that say we need to get rid of sequestration. It's really important to get rid of sequestration, but they all choke on the how.
Well, to a large extent, this is exactly why you have so much frustration about the issue going on right now in the party with leadership, putting another Bush in office, for example, because I think people expect more. And most of these people understand that the one area that the government really needs to focus on, though, is actually keeping us safe. And that's why this is so important, because one of the places that we're actually losing the world, as we've discussed and you've pointed out in many articles, is becoming an ever more dangerous place. Military readiness, I think, is a big problem. And I want to tie back our opening football commentary to this. Is the Air Force pilot who you wrote your article about, she was actually part of what made Martha McSally very popular, is the fact that she was the first combat air pilot, and she flew the A-10. So you talk about military readiness. Here we're about to get rid of these A-10s, which is exactly the type of weapon that we need to fight ISIS, ground-loitering beast that could destroy anything, armor, buildings, or otherwise in a battlefield, and we're going to replace these things with hyper-expensive F-35s, which not only can't they loiter, but they can't even handle the heat in the environment that they would have to operate in. And this doesn't also speak to the readiness of our troops who are exhausted. So I think this is a really, really tough area, because to me it's the one area that we can't cut, but we do need to be a lot smarter about.
Well, people should be frustrated. People should be frustrated because the readiness problems that the military has are real. I mean, that they are using the A-10 in the fight against ISIS right now, but the Air Force wants to get rid of it because they don't think they can afford it in the future. They don't think they can afford it in the future because the F-35 is behind schedule, over budget, underperforming, and it's sucking up a huge portion of the money that the Pentagon needs to buy new weapons. But in one sense, they're stuck with it because the planes they're flying now have been flying and flying and flying in combat for more than a decade, actually in some cases 2 decades since the Gulf War, and they're going to need to be replaced. Some of them need to be replaced right now. And if there's no F-35, you have to buy something else to replace them. A plane, you can't fly a plane until the wings fall off. It has to be replaced. And these problems are real. But what's happening in Washington today is that you've got a rock and a hard place. You've got people the Republicans who want to reduce federal spending, want to reduce the deficit, but still most of them want to provide, who absolutely will not allow entitlements to be touched. And they're backed by the president, who wants to spend more money for free community college for everybody, just as an example right now. Yeah. So and the American people are caught between that rock and the hard place. They have every reason to be frustrated.
What's interesting about your comment just now, not being able to touch entitlements, the Affordable Care Act did probably the most massive job of touching entitlements of any piece of legislation we've seen in decades.
Well, that's why we have a Tea Party. It was a gigantic new entitlement.
Yeah,
that's what prompted it in the first place.
But it drastically impacts Medicare and Medicaid, in ways that people just wouldn't understand because, well, no one even understands what the bill does. But anyway, I don't want to get all sidetracked on that. But I have two important things that I know we have maybe about 5-6 minutes left of today. But I think two things that be, I guess, derelict if we didn't bring into the conversation would be, one, Iran, and two, what's happening in Ukraine right now. And forget what John and I have to say. We'd like to hear your thoughts on both Iran, I guess, with the negotiations, and you could also throw in, because you've written about it, Benjamin Netanyahu coming here to possibly address the Congress and his invitation by John Boehner, and the increased fighting in Ukraine right now and the Russian support and what we should be doing about it.
Well, on Iran, what's important is to look at what the president does, not what the president says. I mean, since coming to office 6 years ago, Barack Obama has not done a single thing to roll back Iranian influence in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world. Not a single thing. And every time he does make a policy shift, like recently in Yemen, it brings his policy more in line with Iran's, not further away. And, even if Benjamin Netanyahu decides he's not going to come to Washington and speak to Congress, or even if they rescind the invitation, most people in Congress are more inclined to listen to the Israeli prime minister than to the U.S. president, because the U.S. president, by taking a hard line against people in Congress who disagree with him on Iran, has squandered his credibility, even with some Democrats. They're more inclined to, it may have been a partisan move to invite the Israeli prime minister, but it's the frustration with the president's credibility on Iran is bipartisan. And the inclination to listen to Netanyahu's arguments is bipartisan in a lot of circles in Congress. And it's the same thing on Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is a bit more difficult. There was a report that just came out today that was co-authored by several top former Obama administration officials, like Michelle Flournoy, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, James Stavridis, who was the NATO commander during the president's first term, that says the United States should help arm Ukraine, which is something the administration has resisted doing. They prefer to rely on sanctions to keep Russia in line. Well, that's not keeping Russia in line. Even if the sanctions are hurting the Russians, it isn't stopping their behavior. So, but any escalation of the pressure against Russia on Ukraine may provoke a Russian response. And that begs the question of whether the United States, that brings up the question, are we prepared? If Russia does escalate, do we have the forces? Do we have the ability to respond in kind? Can we do it? Or is our military readiness in such bad shape that the Russians may be able to put pressure on us in ways that we can't respond? I mean, if you look at space, for example, American astronauts are going to the space station, but they can't get there unless the Russians take them. And the Russian official in charge of the Russian space program has jokingly at this point said, well, we'll get you there, but we might not take you home. Or if you really want to go to space, at one point he said, why don't you just use a trampoline? So, we have to worry about it. We have to worry about that. Anytime you put more pressure on Russia, the United States is backed into a corner where anytime it puts more pressure on Russia, it has to worry about what lever Russia has that can put pressure on the United States.
Right, and this administration doesn't seem to be prepared for any of the moves that Russia may have waiting, but Russia is prepared. Now, you did say that, accidentally you said arming Iran, but in fact, this president is releasing billions of dollars flowing into Iran. He is arming Iran, and he's most likely going to be responsible for their nuclear program being completed.
Well, this is one of the reasons why his credibility in Congress is suffering. His credibility, also his credibility in the Middle East, I should say. It's not just with the Israelis, it's also with the Arabs. Because there is a widespread perception that every time things get tough in the talks with Iran, Obama's ready with a new concession. And that the talks are basically going to end when the president makes enough concessions to get the Iranians to sign something, if that ever happens.
Right. Charles, we're down to about 2 minutes left, and you're right, it is a huge problem. I want to point one quick thing out, which is that Ben Rhodes himself, not too long ago, mentioned, and this is a quote, we're already kind of thinking through how do we structure a deal so we don't necessarily require legislative action right away. And I bring this up in the context of the president is doing everything power to make this a unilateral suicide on behalf of our country. And so when we talk about the breakdown of the post-World War II power structure, we're not just talking about our allies. I think we're actually talking about our own balance of power. I mean, for a lot of decades, we had Republicans and Democrats alike who at least, they may have differed on domestic policy, but they both seem to realize that protecting the country came first.
Well, this is what's going to buy him a veto-proof majority for new sanctions, because every time he runs his negotiating strategy runs into trouble in Congress, instead of negotiating with the members of Congress, they try to find a way around them or try to find a way to ignore them. And this has got the Democrats just as upset about it as the Republicans. There are Democrats who did not support sanctions in the last Congress who are looking at doing it now. And when you ask Democrats, should Congress approve an agreement, they're all going, you bet, yes, just as sure as the Republicans say.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. They don't want to be steamrollered by the White House any more than the Republicans do.
No, and that's where, you know, when you're talking politics, you got to put national security in the best interest of this country first. And I don't really believe the White House is doing it. I think more members of Congress would like to. They're just afraid. And I agree with you, Chuck.
And anybody who says that this is just because that these guys are in Israel's pocket, they're not paying attention.
Oh, that's absurd.
It is. It is absurd. It is.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Charles Hoskinson with the Washington Examiner. He has almost every single day several, if not many, wonderful articles. Go check them out, each and every one of them on so many of these different topics we discussed. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Glad you enjoyed or somewhat enjoyed the Super Bowl, and Happy New Year, and we look forward to having you again soon.
Same here. You all take care, and thanks for having me.
No problem. Take care. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.